So, hello everyone. Today we are speaking with Mahesh Krishnan. He is an innovator, thought leader, author, speaker, and a passionate technologist. He has 28 years of experience in IT. He has worked in India, UK, US, and Australia. He's a regular speaker at local and international conferences. He worked in Wells Fargo Bank, National Australia Bank, Victoria Police, Telstra, and he wrote a couple of books. One of his book is called Silverlight for Dummies and Introducing .NET 4.5. He's a Microsoft Azure MVP. So, Mahesh, to start with, tell me where are you now, which country, and which city, and where do you work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Rafat, and thanks for the nice introduction. When you said all of those things, it sounds more impressive than what really, what it really is. I was a Microsoft MVP for a number of years. I am no longer an MVP. I think I've kind of like moved over to doing a bit more management roles and dropped off the MVP circuit, I think, if I can call it that. I work for a couple of energy startups now as their CTO. They're both sister companies, and they will eventually merge. One of them is called Energy Locals, and the other one is called Energy Trade. I'm based out of Melbourne, Australia, and Energy Trade is based out of Sydney. So these are the two companies that I look after now. The leadership in both these companies are being sister companies. We have the same management leadership team, and eventually, I think we'll merge together. These two companies don't compete with each other, but they kind of like complement. So it makes sense for us to actually merge together. So that's I work as CTO there, looking after the technology part of it. I'm relatively new in this role, in this job. It's been like 3 weeks now. I think I've completed 3 weeks, so relatively new in this job. So
Okay, okay. So, Mahesh, how you will describe a CTO job?
CTO job is, in my mind, uh, like a CTO role is, if you look at the CTO is basically responsible for aligning the technology of the company with what the company really wants to achieve. So in a way, a lot of technical people kind of like aspire to being, a CTO, mainly because they think this is the highest level that they can actually achieve in a company that it combines the mix of technology, management, and leadership. And so in a way, the role of the CTO kind of like changes from company to company. And if you go look at the job descriptions of CTO in a job board or something like that, they'll be completely different. So what people expect from a CTO in a startup is way different to what a CTO is expected in large enterprises and so on. So the role varies, but I think the underlying thing is, if I were to describe it in like one sentence, right, it'll probably be that the CTO's main responsibility is basically aligning the technology of the company with what the company really wants to achieve, like what their goal is and what their vision and mission is, and so on, right? So to achieve that, I think that's where I put it. Yeah.
True, true. Yeah. So, any tip for young developers who want to be a future CTO, like how they should plan their path towards being a CTO?
Yeah, sure. I think so I think in the initial years of a developer, right? I think what they need to focus on is to tone their technical skills, get really better at what they actually do.
Mhm.
I have actually noticed that you kind of need to focus on being a generalist rather than actually a specialist, right? But then you still need to develop deep knowledge in a couple of fields. So let's say um, if the technology company is building on blockchain, right, as an example, then you kind of like need to develop those skills as well. That's going to be one of those core things. Or if the company is specific to a certain domain, if you're in, let's say, in the health industry, right? So knowing that knowledge will really help. But I think apart from the deep knowledge, I think it's good to be a generalist. So you kind of like know at a very wide level what are the things that need to be done, and I think that'll be really important. So if you have an opportunity to become an architect, and start looking at not just, let's say a lot of times what happens is a developer starts and then they spend a number of years in an area that they're really comfortable. But let's say they're working on API development or something, they get stuck on it for a very long time. They kind of like need to move away from it. Or if you're a front end developer, that's what they like doing, and they kind of like keep doing it over and over again. They kind of like need to break away from their comfort zone and look at it from a very high level. So if you're developing a product, for example, you kind of like need to start to understand, look, apart from the API, how are the other things that are actually falling into place? Right? That's the first thing they need to focus on. If you are working at let's say an enterprise level, right? Not to just focus on the kind of things that they're working on. They kind of like need to start looking at, look, these are all the applications that the enterprise or the company uses. How do all of these things fall into place? How do all of these things start to achieve or lead to the business outcome? I think that's some of the things that need to grow into, right?
True.
I think it's really essential for people to start getting delivery skills. So delivery and leadership, I would say, is like a really important part of growth from a developer into like a senior management position, like a CTO. So if any of these developers have an opportunity to become like a scrum master of a team or do a little bit, learn something around project management and program management, I would basically say put your hand up and learn those skills, because they're going to be really useful as you move along the chain. Um, and leadership is a really important aspect of this. So getting people management skills, how do you actually manage people, is going to be really important. If we talk about people management is a really big area. I mean, in a lot of organizations, they give you a lot of support to kind of like help you manage people. So initially you start with managing a few people, then you actually start to manage other people who actually start to manage people. Right. So you become a manager of people managers, and then you start to look at how you start to manage a division or a group and things like that, right? So learning to do all those things, that leadership, the skills, honing in on those skills is really essential as part of the growth from a developer to a CTO, I feel. And then there's a lot of management functions, right? I mean, there are things like financials. Talk about things like OPEX and CAPEX and how do you manage them? How do you manage careers of other people? All of those things, and knowing how marketing works, how sales works, all those kind of things was going to be quite helpful. But I think understanding the domain or the product, kind of like really understanding that, would also be a key thing for a lot of developers, because that helps in the growth within the company itself.
True.
Or even when you go outside. So, if you're really strong in that domain, it kind of like helps you get jobs in similar domains and so on. And sometimes, getting stuck in the same company or period of time, you kind of like starts to constrain your ability to think and everything else. Just going outside, that's why sometimes consulting and all those things, gigs kind of like help you as well. I think this is kind of like a broad level of things.
True. Yeah. No, so thank you very much. I think these are very good tips, that if you are heading towards be a CTO, it's not only about code and your technology understanding, but you have to understand finance and sales and marketing and everything, and see things very holistically. So that's an end goal of somebody to be CTO. But let's talk about the small step a dev take in this journey, because I see when a dev get promoted to a dev lead, his role completely changes. And when he becomes dev manager, which is a manager of manager, his role again changes a lot. And all these steps along the way, he has to change himself. What got him to be dev lead is no more true when he will become a dev manager and things like that. And of course, as we talked about being a CTO, everything is different. So if you can give me some tips for young developers who are becoming dev lead. And then second part of the question, what you should change when you become a dev manager?
Yeah, sure. I think, you hit up on this really interesting question, right? Or concept. It's like, any developer, right? I mean, they don't tend to be a developer throughout their entire life. I mean, there are some people who love doing it, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people, the way that companies and salaries are structured, right, is that as you grow up, it's almost hierarchical in organization. So you kind of like need to be like a developer, and then you go on to become a senior developer, and then a lead developer, and so on and so forth. And along with that comes things like salary, raises and things like that. And some companies do it really well, so they don't tie it down to look, if you're a developer and if you're really good at it, we're going to compensate you based on the kind of value that you actually provide the company. And I think companies in Silicon Valley and in companies in Seattle and so on kind of like do this really well. But if you go look across the world, people are very, very poor with how they actually do these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, one of my biggest peeves is how sometimes salaries are, people aren't necessarily compensated by what they actually contribute. You could be a developer and and you could contribute really well, and you're probably not compensated by it unless you kind of like move up the chain, right? So there is this book that was written called Peter Principle ages ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the 60s or something like that. It's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek book, I suppose, right? But it's very relevant. It says that people in hierarchical organizations kind of like get promoted until they reach a level of incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, right, you could be a really good developer,
Right.
and then you could get promoted into, eventually into, you could be a senior developer. You get promoted into senior developer, and that's fine. You're still doing really well, and then eventually you kind of like reach up to become a dev manager, and all the skills that you had learned up until now, and all the things that all the things that you're really good at, is no longer going to help you, because in a dev manager role, you're going to start to work with a lot more people, and you're becoming a people manager and so on. And so you start to become incompetent in the role, right?
Mm.
And sometimes we actually struggle to identify the fact that we are actually incompetent, and that kind of like leads us to downfall. So in a way, it's very relevant in this industry, right? Because um, what really happens is, as you pointed out, right? So you start your career as a developer, you become a senior developer, and then as long as you're on the technology stream and you keep cutting code and everything else, you're really good at it. And so once you become a tech lead, a dev lead, whatever you want to call it. So now this is the thing that a lot of people may disagree with. If I look at it myself, right, what is the distinction between like a dev lead and dev manager? I think a dev lead generally focuses on, generally ensures that the development part of a project runs smoothly, right? Um, so they're more focused on the project and the delivery aspect of it. The dev manager, on the other hand, is more focused on the people aspect of the project. That
Mm.
is the kind of like interpretation that I make.
Sure.
And again, your mileage may vary. Every company has their own interpretation of what a dev lead and a dev manager is. And this is
True.
where I'd like to. A dev lead is someone who focuses on delivery of the project. A dev manager focuses more on the people who actually implement the stuff, right?
Right.
So for a lot of people, moving over from the journey of a developer to a dev lead is a lot better for them, because they still kind of like hold on to the technology aspect of things. For them, they are probably one of the best techies on the team, so they know how everything falls into place. They also need to know the kind of skills that these people need to learn from a dev to a dev lead is more around planning and execution, like estimation
Mm.
and all this. How long does it actually take to do these things? Um, and push back with the product team and saying, look, this cannot be done because of these reasons, and so on and so forth. How do you kind of like negotiate? I said push back, but it's more like a negotiation kind of thing, right? Saying, well, this cannot be done, that can be done. How all these things fit together, making some of the technology choices for the project and things like that. All of that sits within with the dev lead itself. So you kind of like start to hone your skills, and a lot of this comes with experience. So if you are
Mhm.
a developer for a very long time and you're watching your own dev leads, it's a lot more easier to learn these skills and do a good job about it. Good
True.
job on it.
Yeah.
A dev manager, on the other hand, I think, in my opinion, they should be more focused on the people aspect of things.
Mm.
So this is around, hey, look, what are how do you set individual goals for people? What are the things that they can actually do? How are they tracking? What are the kind of help that they need? setting up one-on-one catch-ups with them every week to see how they're going, having, looking after the health of the team itself. All those kind of things kind of like fall into the dev manager's realm, in my opinion. Again, this is where kind of like some of the leadership skills and everything else, people management skills, I should say, come into play. And they need to learn how to actually manage people, identify people who aren't performing well. How do you deal with them? I found that, for a lot of people, a lot of managers, taking up or sorting out people problems takes a lot of their time and effort. It is like, how do you resolve conflict in the team? As a how do you deal with underperforming employees? How do you deal with them? These are some of those, these are some of the areas that dev leads may necessarily not want to get involved at all.
Yeah.
There's a bit of reluctance to say, look, I don't want to, this person is a friend of mine, I don't want to get involved with it. We've been working, so, all those kind of things are kind of like eliminated by having someone with the necessary skills to deal with it, in my opinion. Yeah.
True. And I think people who are listening, they should realize that as the role changes, whether they want to do all this or not, right? That's not
exactly.
Necessarily you must get promoted. You may be unhappy there. So
I think that's a very valid point that you make, right? I mean, I have had people who come up to me and said, look, I want to apply for this role. And my first question is, that's great that you want to apply for this role. Can you talk about your motivations? Why do you want to actually apply for this role, right? And a lot of times it's always been like, oh, I think, I'm looking for a raise in my salary. And so like, cool, awesome. If you're looking for a raise, let's talk about that. But if you are looking for a change in role, we can actually talk about that. If you want to take on more responsibilities, let's talk about that, right? So what is trying to understand what that motivation is going to really help, right? Because if your motivation is like, look, I want to actually do this role because I think I'm going to earn more money, right? But that's not something that you're passionate about and you're going to enjoy.
True.
It's not going to, you're going to, potentially you may fail in that role because that's not what you're passionate about. Yeah. So I think that trying to understand that is really important. This is where I said like sometimes companies fail in the way that they compensate people, right?
Yes.
So so it's a very valid point that you actually make. You could actually get and a lot of times managers also promote people based on what they have been good at rather than what is needed in the new role that they're going into. This is one of the traps people fall into. I mean, they've been really good in, let's say, as a dev lead, and think this person is so good, I want to reward him. By putting him into making the dev manager, this person is actually going to get a pay increase or something like that. He's moving up the management chain or whatever it is. Let's actually do this. And they go in and they actually fail in that role because they're not cut out for being the dev manager. They probably don't have enough training, and all those kind of things actually contribute to it.
Exactly. In fact, all these good companies, if you see, at least I have experience with Microsoft, they do have a IC part. IC means individual contributor. So you don't have to be a manager to make more money or get to the next level. You can, to the listener, like if you are in a company where the only way for you to go up is to go into management path, and if you don't like it, I think you should leave that company and go to the companies where they really value your skill. And I'm sure Google and other places, I know I just met somebody in Amazon. He's a very, very senior guy, but he's an IC because he's great in what he does. So he don't have to necessarily go in management because he don't want to be. So people should realize what exactly they want to do and which company to be in. Sometimes small companies, they may not be right fit.
I think the tech companies do it really well. You mentioned Microsoft and Amazon, Google, IBM's. These companies have actually been doing this for a very long time, and they kind of like recognize this, and they do it really well. Unfortunately, a lot if you're working in large enterprises and things like that, they don't quite work that way, and they need to change. They need to evolve eventually, right? Or they miss out on these kind of like individual contributors who are really good at what they do,
Right.
they may end up going somewhere else
Yes,
because
exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
As you said that they must change. If they'll not change, they will lose this talent.
yeah.
They will walk away. So Mahesh,
It's a cultural. Sorry, let me. It's
sure.
also a cultural change, I think.
Uh-huh.
I think one, and it'll happen over a period of time. Like I once were struggling to find a certain type of, I suppose, like more like a technical expert in a certain area. So
Hmm.
I did speak to the dev manager who reported into me and said, "Look, it looks like we've given the salary structure and everything else, we'll never be able to get this, like these specialists for the common amount of salary that. So what do you think about hiring someone who's actually getting paid more than you, right?
Hmm.
Is that going to be a problem?" And this person said, "Oh no, I think no, that shouldn't be an issue at all." And I don't mind, if the job needs to get done, we'll hire someone who's getting
Yep.
paid more than me and everything else. And when we eventually found this person and we hired this person, the dev manager was constantly undermining this other person with comments like, "Oh, we're paying you enough money to be able to sort this thing out." And it was
Mm.
becoming so difficult for this other person.
Right.
And I think this is where the cultural aspect of this and the people's acceptance and everything else really really matters as well. So
True, true. No, it's a very important point you brought up, and I think that's where the management responsibility comes in to
mm,
have the culture like that and be acceptable. The managers should be accepting that I can have somebody, first of all, not only who's making more money than me, he may be more qualified. Hey, he may be, PhD in
yeah,
something, and
that's right,
so
absolutely, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And I think they need to recognize that they bring different skills to the table. And
exactly.
you bring different skills, they bring different skills. You're good at managing these people,
Right.
and they are very poor at managing people. That's why you're there. So, and they
True.
are really good, as you said. They're data scientists. They've got like PhDs. They're doing postdoc research and things like that, right?
Right.
And you're getting them. You're managing them, and they may be
True.
making more. They may be compensated more than you, but that's perfectly okay, right? So.
True, true. Cool. So this is very good. I would like, the for our audience, the takeaway here is having the manager title in your, title is not the important thing. The important thing is do what you like, and hopefully everything else will flow because of that, because of your passion. Yeah. So Mahesh, my next question is how you will describe your management style or management
Um,
philosophy, like how you like to manage.
Yeah, sure. I think I call myself more a situational leader, right?
Hmm.
So in terms of management, so the leadership itself. So depending on situation and depending on the person. If you need more, if you're a junior person and you need more coaching and mentoring and things like that, right? I kind of like cater to that. There are certain people who are really good at you delegate stuff across to them and they're completely hands off. They go ahead and do their stuff, and you don't need to kind of like monitor them, and that's what they prefer. I mean, they're really good at what they're doing, kind of like delegate it, and then they go ahead and do that stuff.
Hmm.
There are some people who need to be coached on what needs to be done,
Mm.
but but they've got the experience to, once you actually give them instructions, to actually get to do it.
Mm.
And I think that is the kind of leadership style that I actually follow. We talk a lot about servant leadership and everything else with all these agile methodologies and so on. This kind of like fits very well within that servant leadership kind of model itself.
Hmm.
So one thing that I would like to say, right? I think in the end, your team, if they can actually perform really well without you being involved and with you interfering, you've done really well, right?
True.
And this is one thing that I actually tell people is like, if you are um, uh, if you think that you're going to be irreplaceable, right, and the team depends on you and everything else, nothing can be delegated and nothing can be done by other people,
Right.
then well, where's your promotion pathway and where's your career pathway taking you? You're going to be doing that one thing all the time,
Right.
and that's not a position that you want to be in.
Right.
Yeah, so it gives people you can't go on leave or all that kind of stuff as well. So you kind of like need to make sure that the team functions without you. I think that should be your end goal.
Mm.
and you need to kind of like develop your team so that they can do really well with it. And it takes a while. You go into a new team, you kind of like hire a new team. They probably have a lot of dependence on you, and then over a
Right.
period of time, you kind of like start to delegate, coach, mentor people, and so on, and then you kind of like
Mhm.
make sure that you find someone else to within the team to replace you. So
True, true. No,
yeah.
it's very good point. In fact, when you're talking about company or team performing without you, I was just remembering about Apple. So Steve Jobs, he's seen as a big visionary, and
Hmm.
when he left, everybody thought, "Oh, what's going to happen to Apple?" But I can see his real leadership, where he put people which continued on the
Yeah.
company so far.
Yeah.
And I see that it's across the board. I think if you see in Google or in Microsoft, even now we're going to see it in Amazon, the original leader has
Absolutely.
left, and
Yeah.
these companies all actually flourish so far
Yeah.
afterwards. So
Yeah.
very, very good point. Yeah, that I think you are, whether you are a successful leader or not can be judged by seeing whether once you left, still team and company kept functioning the better
Yeah.
way or not. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So Mahesh, I heard one of your talk in on YouTube. I
Hmm.
don't remember the talk name. It's about being a CTO or how to become a CTO.
Oh yeah.
And there you talked about cognitive biases.
Okay.
So I would like to hear more on it. What do you mean by cognitive biases and how it can help or hinder you in your day-to-day job?
Sure. I think it's more like a I'm not a psychology major or anything for that matter, right? But I think one of the things that I've actually noticed in a lot of the stuff that we actually work is that we bring a strong bias in everything that we actually do, rightly or wrongly, right?
Mm,
There are a number of cognitive biases. I think they'll probably, from memory, I'll try and recall some of the ones that I have encountered a lot. The first one is, of course, confirmation bias, right? I mean, like what people do is they start with a preconceived notion,
mm,
and any result that they actually see, it basically confirms whatever they held to as being true or or false or whatever it is. Basically, they look, this is, I knew this was going to happen because of this, right? And you can look at things like politics itself, right? And you go like, it really doesn't matter whether you're a very strong Trump supporter or not, but all the Trump supporters will go give the same examples that non-Trump supporters will say to say, look, look what he's done, and this is exactly why we actually elected him as leader, right? And
ah,
then people who don't support Trump will say, like, cite the same examples and say, like, this is exactly why we shouldn't have elected Trump, or we should have voted for. And so you kind of like look at it and go like, what has actually basically changed? Nothing's actually changed. Your mind is basically, um, you know, it's for you, it's a confirmation of your own beliefs when some
mm,
incident happens. And
true.
you can actually see this carry on throughout, all the things that we actually do, right? I mean, like if you can go look at examples, um, and for example, technology choices within companies. And if you think that I have been a lot of people and who kind of like have a very strong dislike for Microsoft. There could be
Mm,
no reason why they don't like it, right? And then there may be an outage on Azure, and they'll say, look, this is exactly why you've said you shouldn't go with the Microsoft cloud, right?
mm,
Now, sure, outages happen in other clouds as well, but in their minds, they're kind of like stuck on the notion that this is why we shouldn't have chosen Microsoft.
true.
And the same thing happens. You go look at Facebook or Google, and then they say, look, like, why we shouldn't have chosen it because of privacy issues or something. That the opposite happens as well. You'll see something like Apple coming up with the same idea that Microsoft did a few years ago. The same people
Mm,
who criticized Microsoft for those ideas will go and say, like, what a wonderful idea, right? Look, they've taken
true.
off the earphone jack off on a phone, and this is such a wonderful idea. They'll say that it's because it came from Apple, and because they're a big supporter or fan of Apple, they will
Right.
think that it's a wonderful thing, right? And I see this happening all the time in choices people make within when they're choosing products. A lot of people come from yeah, let's say I've actually worked for company A, and let's say we're looking at the marketing technology stack, right? So if you looked at MarTech stack and they've used Adobe in the past, right? And they come out to a new company and they may be using something else, and they feel that, look, this has to change because that's the only thing that's actually worked in the past. This company, is you've got all these flaws, and we've got to change into this new stack that I'm familiar with. And once it's there, and it'll actually fix all the problems. What we end up doing is we exchange one set of problems for another.
Right.
There's a whole implementation cost, there's a whole bunch of things that need to change. The cost of change is actually very high because it's not just the technology that we're changing. We've got to change people and process and everything else. And so a lot of people don't take a lot of these things into consideration. And so confirmation, their own biases kind of like lead to problems, right? We also have other kinds of biases. Stereotyping is another bias that I've come across, right? I mean, and people have had like very poor experiences with, and kind of like the stereotyping kind of like kind of like cross over multiple things. Like what I said about earlier is about applies in the same thing where you in the past you think that enterprise architects didn't add any value in the previous company you used to work with. They've always been blockers. And so when you move to the new company, they may have a completely different way they work. And you think, no, let's not involve them in any of the discussions that we have because they've always been blockers in the past. Or let's not get the security people involved in this conversation until the very end because they're always saying no to things and they're always asking these questions. And you kind of like have these stereotypes of all these people and this is exactly how they work. And you kind of like carry on this bias throughout.
Right.
I've had a lot of experience with this post-purchase rationalization, which is another one of those biases, where people have made this really huge investment in the technology, right?
Yep.
And even when it is not delivering the goods, they kind of like start putting more and more investment into it, saying, well, look, we spent a lot of money, it's got to be right. And they don't cut their losses and move on kind of thing. So there are lots of biases. I think we can actually keep talking about biases.
True. But I think it's very important to have that self-awareness of your own cognitive biases and make sure you keep it in check. Otherwise, you're right, you'll make more mistakes.
I think that is the key message, right, that you actually mentioned, is that no matter how much you try, you are going to have bias in your mind. And sometimes biases are a good thing as well, right? I think it'll be for you to be aware of these biases and be objective of some of those decisions. I think that's what you need to be, careful with. I think that is the key message. I would say, all those people listening, it's like having a bias is not necessarily a bad thing, but being aware of it is really important.
True. Yeah. So let's shift gear a little bit. I know you're CTO. You must be having a lot of products under you. So I want to know what methodologies you use in your company to develop a product. Talk about some of the engineering best practices you use and what you compromise on and what you don't compromise on. And,
sure. All right. So let's. This is a large topic. There's probably a number of things that we can talk about. And I'll probably start talking about things in no order of priority, right? So I'll talk about things that come to my mind first. I think first and foremost, I'll talk about agile methodologies, right? I mean, like how do you break down your work, how you deliver, sprint planning, execution, how you run retrospectives and all that is going to be a key part of, I suppose, like good engineering practices and so on. Continuous integration and continuous delivery will play a big role. Whenever we talk about CI and CD, I mean, like, you want to kind of like build as much as you can in the build pipeline itself. So, we talk about things like unit testing and all those kind of things. It's very common to see a lot of companies have like, unit tests run as part of the builds and everything else. But you got to kind of like move away from just that. You look at mature teams. They not only do these things, they not only do like peer reviews of code, but they also kind of like include a whole bunch of these things into the build pipeline itself. Things such as checking for secure coding practices or whether we meet certain guidelines. We've used products like Sonar Cube that's actually built into the pipeline in the past. White Source is another product that I've kind of like played around with. It kind of like checks for things like open source vulnerabilities, right?
True.
So you think about some of those things like, look, how do you do this? A lot of these things are done manually. So, by actually putting a lot of these things into the build pipeline, it just makes, we talk about good engineering practices. Those are the kind of things that we should be aspiring towards rather than checking these things manually. It's all automatic, right?
True. True.
Feature flagging and A/B testing, feature flagging really allows you to release to production, frequently. So even if something is not complete, you can keep releasing it. As soon as you commit, you can actually start releasing it to production, and those features need not be visible for people to use. So
do you do your testing also in production a little bit?
Sorry?
Do you do your testing of a feature in production?
I think in the past we have, right? Okay. I mean, like like you said, I've been in this industry for about 28 years. I think every company has a different journey towards maturity of these practices itself, right?
Right.
In some projects, and I won't say companies, because even within a company, from project to project, the maturity actually differs. And the short answer to your question is like, do we do some of the stuff in production? The short answer is yes, right? So some of them have been, there's a lot of testing that actually happens in production. You shut it down and so on and so forth. Even if it doesn't work well, this is the whole point of A/B testing. You try something out and it doesn't work well. Customers don't take it well. You kind of like start to those features eventually disappear as well, right?
Right.
I'm also, in terms of engineering practice, I'm a big believer in architecting your application for resilience and high availability. I've done a lot of talks on this thing. I'm quite passionate about it, and I think some of the stuff needs to be built from the ground up. And I believe that it is an engineering practice, and it's not something that you kind of like add towards the end, just fixing it through deployment. We'll just deploy it into multiple servers and it'll take care of high availability and things like. It just doesn't work that way.
Absolutely.
So, architecting applications with the belief that something is going to fail, right, is really important. So, anything can happen, right? You can have like network issues, hardware failure, transient errors, humans introducing errors into the system, downstream services failing. So how do you actually cater for all of that stuff? Needs to be built into the application itself. Right. So architecting for that is really essential.
How much documentation you put emphasis on while developing this product? Like, do you have a BRD, functional spec, tech spec? Do you write it or not?
Yeah. So I'm not a big believer of big design upfront, where you kind of like go ahead and do a lot of these designs and you document everything else. A lot of projects in recent times we used Confluence to document, so wiki style of documentation. So we do have solution architecture and things like that documented there. There's a standard template that people follow. The standard template makes it easier for people to just document the most important things that is important, that is necessary for the project, rather than actually start to waffle around everything about the project and so on. You have a standard template and say, like, these are the things, this is how, your focus is on diagrams to actually explain everything else. So to answer your question, right, I'm a big believer in just documenting what's enough.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Putting it into an online, like a wiki or something like, like a Confluence or whatever that is, right?
Right.
It is, people kind of like, I'm not a big fan of the term. It's kind of like they talk about this as a living document kind of thing, right? As the document is never it's not final, and changes are being made to it all the time and so on. I'm kind of like big believer in it. So you kind of like start making changes. And because these documents are versioned as well, you kind of like know what the state of the application is at a certain snapshot in time and everything else, and how it's evolving over time. And when new people start on the project, can they get a really good understanding by reading some of this documentation, things like that. That's what I like. So there are two types, right? So I would like to have a document that actually talks about some of the practices that we follow in the team, and the architecture of the application or product
Application.
itself, right?
Yeah.
The code itself has to be self-documenting. So there's no point in actually putting lots and lots of comments within your code and saying, oh, look, this piece of this does that, this piece of this does that, and so on. And so that's, if you need to have a lot of documentation in your code to explain what that piece of code does, then you need to kind of like reassess and redo that piece in my mind.
True. No, what I seen is once upon a time, I think 10, 15 years back, we used to have functional specs like 200, 300 pages spec, which is
And then
written in
nobody
a
read
couple
it.
of months and all that. And now from there, I want, basically in my company, I want a 2-3 pages of spec, which tells me enough that what we are building, at least hand-drawn screen, something that what we are heading towards. And but sometimes people think on the name of agile, just start coding and don't get into any kind of documentation. And I think that's wrong too. You should have something bare minimum, which is important for a team to communicate among themselves.
I think just enough documentation is the right thing, and people can question like, what is just enough, right?
Yes.
And again, it varies from team to team. So if people, you should have, and that's why things like user stories and things like that caught on, because the whole
Yes.
point of like, look, we just write enough to say, well, this is what the functionality is. You kind of like describe it. Some of it, for clarification, you kind of like ask people more about it, and then you kind of like get clarification on it. What your acceptance criteria is and everything else. So, for the testers and so on, they know what they're doing. And that's the capturing the requirements, right? And then the next stage is like, okay, well, now that we capture the requirements, what does the system do? And, how do all the different components fit in together, and everything else forms the other part of it. And, things like API and so on. I mean, these days, you have tools that will actually generate a lot of
a lot of documentation
for you, and that tells you what that API does and so on. So I think that's all that is covered.
Sure.
I think again, touching on the engineering practices and so on, right? I mean, you kind of like need to automate as much as possible. I think that is the core of everything, in my opinion. If you go back and see how we've kind of like evolved as an industry as well. In the beginning, right, like I remember the times where I would compile code in my own PC and hand it over to the people who are deploying it. I mean, so in those days, like when I started, like I was the one who was actually deploying it as well. So
True.
And that changed when it was, like in terms of maturity, there are teams who are actually deploying it, write a script and say, do this, back up the database, do this, do that, and so on. And you give it to them and they do it, right? And we evolved. And then, we kind of like gave scripts to them for them to run. So they would just go and run the script and deploy it. And we've changed everything. Now we don't even have people deploying it. You kind of like have this, CI/CD pipeline actually doing all these things. I spoke about things like even security coding practices and all that checked by the build pipeline. So we are automating more and more. We have automation testing coming in. We've done that. But then, we kind of like hit a snag, I suppose, like once it's put into production, what if something actually goes wrong? And so we started putting things like logs and alerts into the thing and said, look, when something's gone wrong, you get an alert and I'm going to fix it. And then the second question, like, why do we still need someone to go and fix it? Like, why can't we actually even automate that when we have things like self-healing and think this is where like in auto scaling, if some of the resources are running low, can you auto scale? All those kinds of things are all part of the automation thing. So looking for all these opportunities to automate is, I think, part of the core, talk about engineering practice. I think that constant improvement, right? Continuous improvement is part of the whole thing. I think.
True, agree. Yeah. In fact,
And I think
you reminded me of those painful days in Microsoft. I was in Microsoft.com, and there used to be a release team, and there will be a release meeting before we release, and everybody will plan to be in office for a whole night, and we will have multiple pages that you will take the server out, then this database will go offline, then you change. Oh my God. And then this code is deployed to thousands of servers and still manual, all those things going on. Very, very painful time. I'm thankful to, to this new technology that we have got rid of all those manual steps.
And, we used to order pizzas, we'd have outages planned and everything else.
Oh my
and,
God.
like you have like senior management sitting in the offices waiting for,
Yeah,
they're like, is something going wrong? Something happened, what happens when you roll back everything else? Now it's all seamless. You kind of like try and make sure that you deploy with zero downtime, right? So you talk about
exactly,
zero downtime deployments. You do a deployment and actually nobody knows that it's actually done, right? That's the level of
exactly.
maturity that you want to get to.
True, true.
I mean, unfortunately, a lot of companies, we still can't get to that level of maturity, right? I mean, there's
Yes,
still a lot going on in terms of like, you still need to have an outage. And I think that's when you talk about a journey of maturity, I think that's what people need to aspire to.
yeah.
It's like, somebody's making a deployment. Nobody actually knew that it happened. Everything was
That's the
fine.
success. Yes,
That's it, right? So when nobody talks about it, then it's a good thing. So,
exactly, exactly. Yes, true, true. So,
but I
Mesh,
think,
yeah,
I'll
go
just
ahead.
mention one thing, right? I mean, like,
Sure.
you speak about a lot of these things around um, engineering practice and things like that. There are probably two or three things that underpins all of these things. And I think one of the key things is around like a DevOps or DevSecOps, the culture of that, right? I think that's
Mm,
one of those things where people who write code are responsible for, for it in production. And if something goes wrong, they can, they can get paged at night is what they actually say. The standard example is like, oh, you write some code and you kind of like in the past, you handed it over to someone else to look after it. But
right.
what if you get a page get a call at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? So you kind of like need to make sure that nothing goes wrong, and you're responsible for it.
Yeah.
I think there's the second. I think culture is like the culture of innovation within the team, just the ability to
Right.
innovate and do new things. People run things like innovation sprints and so on in organizations to say, look, in this sprint, all we're going to do is like innovation, or they have
Mm,
hack days and things like that to come up with ideas and everything else. And the third thing, I suppose, like in my teams, one of the things that I try and promote is around embracing things like design thinking and human-centered design and all those kind of things, right?
mm,
So kind of like
mm,
make sure
mm.
that it's incorporated in every aspect of work that you do. I think these kind of like, you have all these engineering practices, but I think these things, I'm not sure whether you call them thinking or cultural, whatever it is, kind of like underpins
Yes.
all of those things as well. Yeah.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. All of them, I think, are very, very important for a successful of an engineering team. Yeah. So next question I have, Mahesh, is what you look in a candidate when you hire someone, and you have generally 1 hour to interview somebody, and you have
Yeah.
to make a call.
Yeah, no, this is this is an interesting question. I mean, like the reason I actually laugh about this, right, is I have actually substantially changed my opinion on this over the
Ah,
years.
very good. I want to hear it.
So first, I'll for the listeners who are actually looking for a job, I'll give the I suppose the textbook answer in terms of what they need to plan for, right, and then I'll
Mhm.
come over to my own thinking and what's changed, right.
Right.
I think if you're a developer looking for the next job and things like that, I think one of the things that you need to do is to have a very so like you need to be strong technically, right? So if basically you have to be strong in the technology that the company is looking to hire in. So
Mhm.
if you are if they're looking to hire in, let's say, .NET or Azure, you need to be familiar with Azure. If they're looking to hire in C# or whatever it is, you need to know all the the language, the new language features and things like that. You got to make sure that you're on top of it, because when you go into an interview, they're going to ask these questions.
Yeah.
They may ask you questions like, how is garbage collection being done, right? So you cannot basically say, well, sorry, like I'm not familiar with those kind of concepts, right? So you need to make sure that you're strong in that. And there are lots of sites that you can actually go ahead and look at it, right? So you're going to look at it and say that it's almost like standard interview questions. And, look, and you need to be strong in those things, because a lot of companies will just go and ask these very specific questions on, talk to me about this feature in C# and so on.
Mm.
The second thing I would say is like, you got to get your basics right. So when we talk about basics, got to have a strong understanding of things like data structures and algorithms and, computational complexity and all that kind of stuff. And I know companies like Microsoft and, Google and Amazon, they will definitely ask you questions, right, about
Yeah.
how good you are with some of those things. And this only comes by, this is the theoretical part of it, and how you would actually apply that. And I mean, they may not ask you, come on, go and explain how a hash table works or something like that. They'll give you, I'm assuming you've been in Microsoft, you'll probably be able to say this, right, really well.
True.
It's like they'll ask you questions and how do you solve the problem, and they'll look for how you're using some of these data structures and algorithms to solve a certain kind of problem. So I think you need to have that, right? One of my pet peeves in the in the IT industry is that we do have a lot of people who don't have an understanding of some of these basic concepts, right? And there is and it's kind of like created a very poor opinion about the industry itself externally. So the standard answer to the thing is like, have you started restarting the application, or have you shut down have you shut down your machine and restart it again? That'll actually fix the problem. And imagine it never happens in another industry, right? I mean, you don't basically go, someone, a doctor doesn't say, let's put this patient, let's make him clinically dead, and then we'll revive him again.
Yeah.
But in our industry, it's perfectly okay for something like that to happen, right?
Yeah.
And so much so, even if you watch movies, right, and then you go like, the space station is under threat. The thing that we need to do is we've got to shut down and reboot the system, and everything will be fine. Everything's running on software. I'm like, oh my god.
But this will start happening in the car now.
Yeah, that's
right. You
right.
have to reboot the whole car sometime because something is not working.
Yeah, because software, right? Because they're all running software in it.
Yeah.
So sorry. I digress from where we started, right? I think for a lot of people, for aspiring candidates, following leaders within the industry, like particularly thought leaders, will do them a whole load of good, and look at what are the really cool things that's actually happening. Keeping in touch with technology and everything else that'll actually that'll really help them. Increasing your profile will not hurt at all, right? I mean, contributing to open source projects is a very good example. I mean, you can learn from looking at other people's code, and by contributing to open source projects, you have your name up, and people can actually look you up on GitHub, right? Just like as they're looking you up on LinkedIn and things like that, right? They'll look you up on GitHub. So contributing to all these open source projects and everything else will be good. Posting regularly to, I think, even on LinkedIn or blogging. I'm not sure, blogging is kind of like died down a little bit, but still people still blog, and you still put yourself out there. When people Google your name, Bing your name, whatever it is, they still, they can see what you've been up to, and that'll increase your profile. You talk about branding and everything else that'll actually help you. I'll also say, if you have an opportunity to attend meetups and network with people and all that, that'll help. Doing talks and all that, all these things actually improve your profile, right? So once your profile is really good, I mean, finding a job, it's easier to find a job.
True.
Now, and this is, going back to, I think this kind of like answers the other thing that I was laughing about, and why I've actually changed some of my opinion. And I think there are probably three parts of this question, right? First thing is this is the stock standard thing that people need to do to actually get a good job. Mm-hmm. The second part, I suppose, in your question is what is it that I look for people? And people, and in a way that kind of goes to this third part is what's changed in my own thinking about why some of these things are also what I actually said in the first place, and these are things is also wrong to a certain extent, right? Mm. In my mind, I look for when I'm looking for a candidate, I look for passion. So the passionate, do they have the passion to learn things, and are they passionate about the product that they're working on? And so that, I think that is important. Of course, the first thing that I said is I think they need to have the core competency that the job requires. I mean, that's the first thing. Maybe that's the first thing, and then the second thing is probably the passion part. So the reason I say core competency is that not every organization has the ability to groom people and grow them. And say you start from you're just fresh out of university and things like that. They have enough people to support you to help you learn on the job and grow and all that. So a lot of companies don't have that luxury of doing it, right? Mm-hmm. Literally, a lot of these people are thrown in the middle of a project because it's in chaos and say, look, we need you to come and help and so on, pick up the pieces and so on. So depending on the situation and so on, I always look for people with the right skills. So if I am, need someone if I'm deploying to Azure or AWS, I'm really looking for people with those skills, right, so they can come and help other people within the team, right? So, True. So it depends on the situation, but I think that's one thing that I'll always look for, right? But the third thing that I'll look for is, I suppose, like these days is like around diversity of thought.
Mm, mm,
And see, for a long time, I used to hire people that were very similar to me, right? So it's like,
mm,
look, I sort of said, like, look, I do things like I'm doing a lot of things outside of work hours, and I'm, doing this and doing that. If I hire those kind of people, that'll be really good, right?
mm.
And but I think people who are very similar to you, who or think very similar to you, is kind of like a big barrier in terms of growth and innovation and everything else. I mean, you need to have people who think differently and do things differently. So you
True.
need to kind of like have people come in and challenge some of the stuff. So that's why I think when we
Yeah.
talk about diversity, I talk about things like people who come from a different, gender is an important one, different
Mm,
gender, different ethnic background, people who have different likes and dislikes, people who got a creative mindset, and people who are very analytical, right?
right.
Um, Introverts, extroverts, right? The people who
Right.
really like to sit quietly in the corner and do their stuff without, they kind of like draw their energy from within. And you have
Right.
those extroverts kind of like need the energy from others to drive it. So you need to have those kind of combination of people. Um, like you need people rather than actually saying yes to everything as a boss. If
Right.
everyone's agreeing to everything,
Mm.
then you don't want that, right? You want people to actually challenge you, right?
Challenging.
And then
Yeah.
um, that all that is, I think, important. In fact, once someone actually came over to me and said, like, why have you hired this person? And both these people are reporting into me, and so like, why have I hired this person? It's always disruptive, it's always like questioning. And I said, like, that's because like nobody else is actually doing that. I
Doing that.
specifically hired the person to actually challenge
True.
everyone.
True.
And it's not that every time he challenges, we're going to go with whatever he says, right? But
True.
bringing that additional
Different
element into this,
thoughts. Yeah.
right? And that is really important. And I think so I look for that, and I also so not only do we need these, like what I call these rock star developers, right? And we talk
Hmm.
about these 10x developers and so on and so forth, people who are really good at what they're doing, and productivity actually goes 10x times or something like that by these people having. Um, but you also need those people who bring things like empathy and creativity into the mix of things. So these are the
True.
people who think, look, if you do these things, it's not going to help our customers, kind of stuff. Because
Right.
these 10x developers may not have that mindset. It's like, oh, let's actually do
Yes.
this thing. This is, let's automate this. And I think that is that is really important, right?
Yes.
And kind of like going back to this original thing is like, what has actually changed in my mind is, it's funny enough, I think I saw this thread on Reddit a number of years ago, and it was about it was actually funny, but it was almost like it hit home some hard truths as well, right? It was about, I think, like what if we hired doctors like we hired software engineers or something like that, right? I think that I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember the exact thing, but it was in the, I'm paraphrasing, or from memory.
Hmm.
And there are, I think, questions like, okay, so what do you do when you're not practicing medicine? What do you do in your spare time?
Hmm.
And do you do you perform surgeries during your spare time? Do you kind of like free consultation in for people and stuff like that? And you mean like you mean like not doing all of this without getting paid? And it's like, yeah, I mean, like, we are looking for passionate people who just don't do this for money. I'm like, they're making a point over there. We in the software industry have kind of like built this up that
Yes.
be passionate. You should be doing all these things in extra hours because, like, hey, I do this thing. Everybody that I hire needs to do this thing,
Right.
and everybody's situation is different.
True.
All
True.
right. I mean, like they and situations different during different times within their lives.
Yes.
You may be single and you have a lot of time, and you spend all your evenings and nights coding stuff and everything else.
Right.
But then after a period of time, let's say you have kids or whatever it is, and you have family that you need to take care of, and you may, and all these kind of things actually act on you, and you kind of like need to move away. You probably devoting time to your family and everything else, and that's perfectly okay,
True.
right?
True.
And so it is really important that we find the right person to help like this person should be able to contribute to the job,
Yeah.
right? And so this is where I say, like, look for things like, they have to have a core competency, and they should be passionate at what they're actually doing.
True.
And you need to hire different people, like, so you get the diversity of thought. But these are the three things that we should be doing,
Yes.
right? But unfortunately, the industry is very different. And the things that I actually quoted before, like, hey, go do these things. You got to, if getting a certification is important, go and get the certification, because it's going to help you get a job, right? Because
Yeah.
not every employer is going to go look for these three things, and you got to, if you can find an employer who actually looks just for these, passion, whether you have the passion and whether you're really good at what you're doing, then good on you, and that's what you need to focus on.
True.
But if you want to get a job easily, focus on these other things. So,
True. True. No, in fact, you showed a lot of maturity in your thinking, and I hope our audience, who is most probably our very young devs, are
mm,
listening to this interview. They should realize this. Uh, One is you talked something very, very important, and I want to underline it again because you talked about now when you're hiring, you're looking for diversity. You are not looking for people exactly like you, and you very well explain what is diversity. Diversity means not only how people can look differently, but how they can think differently. Diversity of thoughts, being introvert, extrovert, questioning the system. So all those things actually points out to be yourself, be who you are, because
mm,
that's fine too, because you are bringing diversity because the way you are. and
mm,
and after having the core competency, just stay, I will say that, be authentic and be
correct.
yourself, and
That's
that's
right.
that's a very, very important point. And yeah, thank you for talking about it and how you change your thinking. I think I'm also in same boat uh, by myself, that once upon a time I used to think, if in your spare time you're not coding and contributing to open source, maybe you're not passionate. But uh, to keep your passion for a long time, now I see myself like same like you. I'm in this industry for 25 plus years. You have to be doing different things on weekend
Yeah,
or evening to keep that fire going.
yeah,
Otherwise you'll just burn out very, very
yeah,
soon.
yeah,
So all very, very good points, so thank you for that. To be successful in corporate life, you should be able to manage up and manage down. And a
yeah.
lot of young devs, I feel they get confused, like what is the meaning of managing up and managing down? So if
Yeah.
you can give some tips, what do you mean
Yeah,
by
sure.
managing up and managing down?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really good question, right? I mean, it's and during my career, I mean, like, I've been around in the industry for a long time. I've struggled with this as well. It's not like, you kind of like know how to do these things, and you kind of like
Sure.
learn over a period of time. And I've actually found that sometimes it's actually, you've got to manage expectations in three ways, right? One is like how you manage expectations up to your bosses and so on. Like, what is the stuff that they need, and how do you actually manage it?
Right.
To your own peers, right? Like, look, you're committing something to them, and how do you do this? And it's another thing. And of course, to all the people who report into you, like, how do you, how do you kind of like keep them happy and all that kind of stuff? And it's sometimes very difficult to do all three really well. Some people are more comfortable with managing expectations up. It's like,
Mhm.
your bosses basically say, look, this is what is it. They're really good at saying, they'll send an email and say, look, this is what it is. And then they'll say, look, this is what's happening, and so on and so forth. They'll keep them updated with everything else. And they're really happy with the progress and everything else, right? But they don't actually talk to the people who are reporting to them. And they're kind of like kept in the dark, and like, what's happening? I don't know what's happening. Like, I get this information really late. And some and the same, or the other way around, right? So you're really good at managing the team and everything else. You're doing such a good job about it, but you don't actually mention the successes of the team to
Mm.
your managers, and to your peers and so on, right? And you say, you almost think, oh, this is what is expected of the team, this is what we do, and so that's perfectly fine, I don't have to tell these people. And so they actually don't know what you're doing.
Mm.
So I think the first thing is, which I've learned over the years, is to actually celebrate success, right, within the team itself.
Right.
So you need to, any success that you have, no matter how small they are, you kind of like do it publicly, right? Criticism is generally dealt with in private, but yeah, successes should be celebrated, and you talk about it a lot, and that needs to kind of like circulate up, down, sideways, all that kind of stuff. Number one.
True.
The second thing is for you to identify who are the key people that you need to communicate, right? So drawing a stakeholder map really helps. Like for a lot of people, you need to say like, how do I need to get them involved with it? Do I need to keep them updated?
Mm,
Right? Like just informed and
true.
people develop things like races and so on and so forth. And in a way, all those things are kind of like meant to help you with how you communicate or how you involve them and so on and so forth. So my tip is, if there's one simple thing I'll say is like try and create your own RACI, right? Or diagram that actually talks about who are the people who you need to inform, who are the people you need to get involved, and all
True.
those kind of things. Kind of like prepare a list, and also kind of like have some kind of an operating rhythm in like how frequently you need to kind of like communicate with them, right?
Right.
Whether it's through a meeting, whether it's through an email, and everybody's got their own operating styles.
Right.
So if you can actually manage that well, I think that's really good. And if you move on to um, if you move on to I suppose like to a leadership role of something in your company, like when you have people reporting into you and you have a lot of colleagues that you need to work with and upwards and so on, the operating rhythm is really important. When I talk about operating rhythm, it's about who are the people that how do you actually communicate with them and how often you do it. So if you got a whole bunch of if you need to run one-on-ones with your the people who immediately report into you, well, what's the cadence of it? Do you do it once a week? Is it twice a week? I mean, there's no rule that says this is how it's got to be, right? It's up to
True.
you and the team to actually set that. How often do you need team meetings? So you have one-on-ones, but you've got like you're managing a team of 5, right? Do you do it once a week? Is it twice a week, right? And
Yeah.
what is it that you want to discuss in these meetings,
True.
right? That's going
True.
to be really important. And then if you're looking after a larger team, right? So when do you involve all of them? It's almost like a town hall and things like that. Like how often do you do it? Do you do it once a month, right?
Right.
Do you do it twice a month? There's no, again, like I said, there's no real right formula for it, right? Some people do it once a quarter. So they call the whole team, right? All the managers who report into you, and then all the people who report into them, bring them in big room, or these days, you can actually do it through Teams or whatever it is, Zoom or whatever it is.
Right.
And you got to decide what you're going to what you're going to communicate to the team.
Right.
Sometimes the trap that we fall into is that we get fed a lot of information because we are probably in leadership meetings and other team meetings and things like that, and we hear a lot of things, and we basically naturally assume that everybody knows those things, and actually they don't, because they're too
Mm,
focused on day-to-day work. If you're cutting code, hey, look, like I'm developing APIs, that's the only thing that I know about, right?
right.
And so you need to kind of like start mm, uh, to pass on the message that your own bosses have actually given to you down to your team, because that's what your role is, like to basically to communicate all those kind of things. Like I said, you got to celebrate successes and so on, right? I mean, this is the thing about having not just success. You can actually celebrate things like birthdays and
Yeah.
you've been in the company for 10 years. Calling that out in some of these town
Mm,
halls and so on is actually a good thing. It kind of like keeps a lot of people happy that they're being acknowledged for those
sure.
things. Again, talking about operating rhythm and cadence, how often do you need to set up a meeting with your own peers, right? Let's say you're a CTO, and then you have like a CFO or other GMs from the business and everything else. Do you
Mm,
meet up with them frequently and tell them what your team is doing and find out what their needs are, how your team can actually help them and all those kind of things? That is really crucial, I think, in terms of
mm,
managing their expectations. Your question is like, look, what is your expectation from me and my team? Are they being met? What else can I do? If they're not being met, is there something I can do?
right.
What is happening in your team that's going to be useful for my team that I can actually pass on? That little piece of information is going to be quite useful in having that relationship with your peers.
Right.
And of course, there's also there's all this project statuses and so on and so forth that you kind of like need to make sure you pass it on to your bosses so that they are happy with it. Um, Good news should be shared as soon as they become available. Bad news should be passed on even earlier than that.
Yes, that's
So if
important.
something is going bad, right, it's better to actually keep them informed. And look, something is not going well in this thing. So, I think I have it under control, or it may actually spiral out of control, but I'm just giving you a really early heads up.
Right. And
And
sometimes you get help also.
that's right. So you can
Right.
actually shout out for help. And that's a really important point that you actually made, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think for a lot of us, we talk about stakeholder management and so on and so forth. Calling out for help is really important,
Yes.
and sometimes our own egos don't permit it. It's like, oh, I'm not going to ask for help, and I can manage.
Yeah.
I've done this in the past. We can actually do it, and so on and so forth. And I think we kind of like need to recognize the fact that you can't do everything on your own. So you kind of like need to leverage on support, and you'll find that people are all looking, most people in companies will kind of like, they're all looking towards the success of the company and success of the product and things like that. They'll be more than happy to pitch in, right?
Yeah.
So kind of like need to trust people and then tap into them for help and so on. So shouting out for help is a really really important thing. Yeah.
True. No, very good point. I think it is very important to understand what it means by managing up and what it means by managing down to be
Yeah.
successful manager. So my next question I have, it is about sharing your failures. And when I say failure, I don't mean only professional, but personal also, because the idea here is I want people to see that, how you came out of the failure. What did you learn? How did it change you? Because you worked in 4 different countries or different
Yeah.
big companies,
Yeah.
and I believe you started from India and
Yeah.
ended up in Australia. So it's a big journey, and
Yeah.
and for sure in this journey you may have gone through ups and downs.
Yeah.
So if you can share something about your failure.
Yeah. So this is you know um I wouldn't call them failures. More like I see a lot of things as setbacks. And
Mhm.
I've worked in projects where the project has been shelved, right? And
Sure.
then you go and look at it, it's like, oh man, we did put so much effort into it, and then it got canned. I've worked on startups where I've put in a lot of effort into it, and it's I've invested a lot of my own time, and which kind of like equals money into it,
Mhm.
and nothing's actually come out of it. I've in one of the startups, like I kind of like spent so much time on it that not making any money out of it. I was just using up all my savings and everything else. We
Mm.
had a deposit for a house that eventually kind of disappeared
Oh
because
wow. Mm.
right.
Big
So you
sacrifices.
have all these kind of things. I think you learn a lot from these things. Um, uh, I think like I should say that I'm doing fairly okay, in terms of my career and where I am in life and so on and so forth. So the only advice is like everybody's got setbacks, right? I mean, it's eventually like, you can't be bogged down by that. And you see some of the big, I suppose, really successful entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. They probably had several failures before they've come up with this big
Sure.
idea and become
Yeah.
a huge success, right? I generally tend to be a little bit risk averse, right? And
Mm.
so when you do have failures, such as startups not doing really well and so on, you kind of like fall back into let me go back to what I know best. Just go work for someone, just use my own skills and do it, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And then you do have family and children and everything that you want to support. You got to kind of like
Yeah.
start taking a bit more conservative approach to things, right?
True.
So the one advice is like, I would say that if people want to take a lot of risks and things like that, just take it in the early part of your life when you don't have a
Yes.
lot of these things to worry about, right? And then and
True.
then you have these failures, you can quickly bounce back. So
Yeah.
I suppose the older you get, you're a little bit more risk averse,
Yeah.
and you're a little bit more afraid of failures, I would say, right? So you try
More
to take
responsibilities, so it
more
become
responsibilities and things
difficult.
like that. You
True.
still got a mortgage to pay, you got to pay for your school, this
Yeah.
fees for your children, school fees, and planning all these kind of things, and you kind of like tend to be like, I'm going to be very conservative. And it's not a bad thing, right? But I think
True, true. Yeah.
so,
Okay. So, tell me about the worst advice you heard about the management, which you thought later on, maybe, with your experience, you look back and you said, man, that was really a bad advice.
I wouldn't say a bad advice, but I actually thought I would never use this on someone ever again. Um, once one of my bosses actually uh, called me and said, "Look, Mahesh, like we're going to do this project, and I've basically had a chat with the CIO, and we're going to do this project in 3 months' time, and I've just committed that we're going to do it in 3 months' time, and if we don't do it in 3 months' time, your job is on the line."
Hmm.
Like I was like, oh, it's like, well, um, so you haven't had this conversation with me about how long it's going to take. You haven't consulted me in this one, but you had the conversation with the CIO, and you put my job on the line if I don't meet your commitment. It's like,
Hmm.
he did think for a second about the ridiculousness of what he actually had just done, and
Hmm.
then he just had a one-word answer, and he said yes. I'm like, okay, so how are we gonna? It was like, like, and I looked at it. The first week when I looked at it, it looked like a death march. Like, this is like,
Hmm.
no way we're gonna do this thing. But as we often do, you kind of like, when you're, it did get me fired up. So I was like, we're gonna do this thing no matter what, and we did
Hmm.
complete it on time, and I we've delivered in 3 months' time, and then I quit my job as well. And
Ah,
I said, why are you leaving? And it's like, oh, no, I don't think that was, what you put me through was the right thing.
true.
And he said, no, I just did it to motivate you. And I said, like, this is not the kind of
Wow, that's not a motivation.
so I need to leave.
Hmm.
So and I thought, like, in a way it was a lesson for me, like, how do you actually treat your own people?
True.
I think that was like a valuable lesson that I actually learned, is like, I think, you need to kind of like treat your people really well, and you always need to, if that's not how you like to be treated,
Yeah,
right, then you shouldn't be treating other people that way. I think
absolutely.
that's a lesson I took from it, I think. And I think I couldn't think of any other example, unfortunately, because
No, no, that's. I think that's a good one. It is a worst advice, I will say, of on management as such. So tell me the best advice you heard about management, which you like, which stays with you.
good advice. See, I think, as part of companies, right? I think they've put me through like various leadership programs and things like that, right? And there's a lot of takeaways from that. But I think one of the key takeaways is for me is to be empathetic and look after your people. I think um, that has actually helped. I think you look after your people, and I always one of the things that I've actually learned over the years is to kind of like trust your own people. And if someone
Mm,
comes over and say, look, I want to do this job or whatever it is, I would like to get promoted. And you may say, look, fine, you want to get into this new job, you want to get promoted, but there are certain gaps in what you're actually doing. Let's actually work through those gaps,
mm,
and we'll actually promote you. And you promote the person, or you put that person to a certain role. It's not necessarily promote, it can be like one role to another role or whatever it is, right? Moving sideways and so on. um, you work on and say, well, I see there are certain gaps. We'll actually work that through with you. And I've actually found that by doing that, you kind of like earn the loyalty of that person a fair bit. They kind of like, they give their 100%. So sometimes I've realized that over the years is that rather than actually going away externally and looking for this perfect person to fill in a role, if you
mm.
can find people within your own group who are eager to do that job, even if there are some gaps, you can actually work through those gaps either before they move into that role or during that time. I've found that it's actually worked out really well. So I don't know, like I may change your opinion on this one later on, but I
Yeah.
think that's one thing that I've actually found that's actually worked well. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's very good. Spot on. Okay. So the last question now, the books which influenced you most, or the
Right.
books you will recommend any aspiring devs to want to be
This
CTO.
is This is a hard question, actually. Funnily enough, when you did introduce me and you said, "Oh, you've written a book on Silverlight," I kind of like cringed a little bit because I kind of like noticed that I wrote the book on Silverlight, and as soon as I wrote the book on Silverlight, I think within a year or so, Silverlight as a technology died completely.
Yeah.
And so, and then I wrote a book on .NET, and then .NET kind of like moved over to .NET Core, and of course, they
Right.
moved for a while. I thought, like I had like uh, .NET as a technology would also die, and it will just completely move to .NET Core or whatever it is. But that didn't
Right.
happen. So, so I'm glad I don't have that kind of like I suppose like a dark touch to put technologies to death or anything.
Mm.
To come back to your question, I don't know. Like there are a lot of good books that I've actually read. Nothing actually stands out. But one thing, right? One of the books that I've had a lot of influence on me was Programming Windows 3.0 by Charles Petzold,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right?
It affected
So,
generations of devs, I believe.
so when that was the one book that actually really got me into writing programs in Windows and so on and so forth.
Right. Right.
So it's not really like a what people would call like a, hey, look, this is the a book that's actually influenced my thinking or whatever it is. But that book, when I read it, I page by page had actually gone through the book and tried everything on the book, and I inside out, I mean, like that was one of the biggest influence in terms of pushing me towards a career in
Right.
programming in Windows. And this is
I
the first thing.
remember that time that book was the only source to learn about Windows 3.0 because internet was not there.
That's
There
right.
used to be MSDN,
MSDN was the other source of information,
that's
and I
it.
really look forward to getting those MSDN
Yeah.
because there was a wealth of information in it, right? But
Yes.
this is almost the Charles Petzold book even predates MSDN. So
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
like at that point, until I started working, I didn't have access to MSDN, and that book was, I learned all my Windows programming in that book, and
Yeah.
so yeah. So
Same with me. I was in Kuwait and I was a C developer at that time using Windows 3.0, building application in Arabic, multilingual, Arabic and
wow,
English.
yeah,
And there was a 640 RAM and 348 max extended RAM you can get. You have to write code so you can flush things to disk and then bring it back. Oh my God, that was painful days of coding.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so very good. Thank you very much, Mahesh. It was very, uh, very, very interesting conversation with you. I hope our audience learned a lot from this conversation. I learned a lot. So thank you very much. I
Yeah,
appreciate
sure.
your
No,
time.
thanks for having me. I think a lot of what is just my immediate thoughts on the subject,
Mhm.
whatever came to my mind right away as we spoke.
Sure.
And I think initially I was a little bit slow, and I think my thoughts started picking up as we started talking as well. So
No, what we will do, often, people who are watching this, they leave some questions and we can do a part two also later on if there are enough questions on certain subjects.
sure.
So cool. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Yes. Bye.